Their codes had been compromised. Our trap was established. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, I found myself on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, observing our fearless dive bombers as they prepared for takeoff, their engines growling like furious lions ready to pounce. The Pacific Ocean lay before us, stretching infinitely, bathed in golden light from the rising sun, deceptively tranquil for what was soon to become the resting place of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most esteemed carriers. Somewhere out there, 200 meters northwest of Midway Island, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, those very vessels that had wreaked havoc at Pearl Harbor merely 6 months prior, were confidently advancing towards their objective, their decks brimming with aircraft, and their crews gearing up for what they anticipated would be yet another effortless triumph. Unbeknownst to them, we had been intercepting their communications for weeks, fully aware of their location and poised to execute the most catastrophic ambush in naval history. I am Norman Jack Dusty Kleiss, a lieutenant junior grade and a dive bomber pilot with Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise. Born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, I graduated from the Naval Academy. In 1938, I earned my wings in April 1941 and had been engaged in combat missions since the raids on the Marshall Islands. By June 1942, I believed I had a grasp on carrier warfare. However, nothing could have prepared me for the spectacle we were about to witness. The utter annihilation of Japan's carrier fleet in mere minutes. A moment that would alter the trajectory of the Pacific War entirely. The ready room on the Enterprise was dense with cigarette smoke at 0400 hours on June 4th. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey Jr., our Air Group commander, stood at the front with a pointer in hand. McCluskey, a Naval Academy graduate of 1926, had assumed command of the Air Group just 2 months prior. "Gentlemen," McCluskey began, "the Japanese carrier force has been identified approximately 200 meters northwest of Midway." He tapped the map. 4 carriers, including Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, were supported by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. These carriers were not ordinary. They represented the core of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force. Akagi and Kaga, both veterans of Pearl Harbor, were formidable vessels capable of launching over 60 aircraft each. Sōryū and Hiryū, being newer and faster, were equally lethal. Collectively, they carried 248 aircraft and boasted the most skilled carrier pilots globally. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been deciphering the Japanese naval code JN-25 for several weeks, McCluskey elaborated. "We are aware of their complete operational plan. They intend to strike Midway at dawn and then wait for our carriers to respond, allowing them to ambush us. What they fail to realize is that we are already present." The intelligence officer detailed Admiral Yamamoto's strategy to seize Midway and eliminate our carrier fleet. It was intricate, perhaps overly so, involving invasion forces from the southwest, a diversionary attack in the Aleutians, and the carrier strike force approaching from the northwest, with Yamamoto himself directing from the battleship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind. "The Japanese will initiate their Midway strike at 0430, he stated. "Most of their fighters will be engaged, and their carriers will be in the process of recovering and rearming aircraft, marking their most vulnerable phase. This is our moment to attack." Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who commanded Scouting Squadron 6, took meticulous notes. A veteran of Pearl Harbor, Gallagher was thorough in his observations. Next to him, Lieutenant Richard Best from Bombing Squadron 6 analyzed the weather conditions. The wind was blowing southeast at 5 knots with scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, creating ideal diving conditions. I surveyed my squadron mates. Some were seasoned combat veterans while others were preparing for their inaugural battle. We all recognized the gravity of the situation. The Japanese possessed superior fighters. The Zero could outmaneuver any aircraft in our arsenal. They had more experienced pilots, and we would be operating at the extreme edge of our fuel range, 175 miles out and back with minimal reserves. Torpedo 8 from Hornet will be the first to launch, McCluskey noted. The dive bombers will follow. We are set to launch at 0700 by 0600. The flight deck of the Enterprise was a scene of controlled chaos. Deck crews donned colored jerseys as they executed their specialized duties. Red shirts were loading bombs, purple shirts were fueling the aircraft, and brown shirts were inspecting mechanical systems. I made my way toward my aircraft, SBD Bureau number 639. My rear gunner, John Snowden, was already in the process of checking his twin .30 caliber machine guns. Snowden hailed from Illinois, a reserved individual who had previously saved my life by identifying incoming Zeros. "Good morning, Snowden," I greeted him as I climbed aboard. "Good morning, Mr. Kleiss. It's going to be hot today." I proceeded with my pre-flight inspection, checking control surfaces, bomb rack, and fuel load. We had 230 gallons in the main tank, along with two 58-gallon wing tanks. With careful management, this would provide approximately 412 hours of flight time. The SBD Dauntless was not the fastest aircraft, with a top speed of 255 mph, but it was remarkably stable during dives and incredibly resilient. It could withstand damage that would incapacitate other aircraft. I secured myself in the cockpit, surrounded by familiar instruments: altimeter, airspeed, fuel gauges, engine temperature, and oil pressure. At 0645, the command to start engines came over the loudspeaker. I engaged the starter, and the Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine roared to life. The first to launch were the fighters, 20 F-4F Wildcats designated for combat air patrol. Following them were the torpedo bombers, 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. I observed them as they lumbered down the deck with their Mark 13 torpedoes, barely clearing the edge of the deck. They appeared vulnerable. Finally, it was our turn, scouting 6 under Gala with 18 planes, bombing 6 under Best with 15 planes. I was positioned as number 2 in the 3rd Division, with McCluskey leading us all. The launch was always perilous. The Enterprise turned into the wind and increased speed to 30 knots. The flight deck officer waved his flag for full power. The flag dropped. I released the brakes and surged forward. The island flashed by as the deck edge approached. At 65 knots, I eased back and felt the wheels lift off the ground. For a brief moment, the heavily laden bomber hovered in the air. Then the wings engaged with the atmosphere, and we began our ascent. "Good takeoff, Mr. Kleiss," Snowden remarked. "Thank you. Stay alert," I replied. It took an hour for the strike force to assemble. By EO-806, we had 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise climbing to an altitude of 19,000 feet. The scheduled rendezvous with the Hornets group never materialized. McCluskey opted to proceed independently rather than waste fuel. We flew northwest at 19,000 feet in complete radio silence. I continuously monitored the instruments and the bomb site. At this altitude, I would have approximately 10 seconds to align and release the bombs. There would be no second chances. At 0920, we arrived at the intercept point. There was nothing, just an empty ocean. My fuel gauge indicated that over half had been consumed. A quick calculation suggested we had about 30 minutes to locate them before we would need to turn back or ditch. the radio silence was stifling. Everyone was performing the same calculations. Then, at Luro 955, McCluskey waggled his wings. Looking down, I noticed a white wake, a solitary destroyer speeding northeast. McCluskey turned to pursue, wagering that it was heading towards the main fleet. For 20 agonizing minutes, we trailed that wake, our fuel dwindling towards empty. Then, at 10:20, we spotted them. The Japanese fleet emerged below like toys scattered on a blue carpet. 4 carriers in 2 groups, surrounded by escorts. Aircraft were on the decks, white wakes indicating their maneuvers. Remarkably, there were no Zero fighters at our altitude. All were down low, finishing off the torpedo squadrons. This is McCluskey, scouting 6. Target the left carrier, bombing 6. Focus on the right. However, in the midst of confusion, both squadrons began their dives on Kaga. I pushed forward and nosed into my dive. The acceleration was intense, pressing me back into my seat. The altimeter unwound. 18,000, 15,000, 12,000 feet. The carrier loomed larger in my bomb sight. I could see aircraft on the deck, crew members scurrying, anti-aircraft guns swiveling, and black flak puffs bursting around us. But I maintained my course. At 10,000 feet, I observed individual planes on KGA's deck being refueled and rearmed, hoses snaking across the deck, bombs on carts. The timing was perfect. It was their most vulnerable moment. Gallagher was the first to release. His bomb struck near Kaga's island, igniting a fire. Bodies were propelled into the air. At an altitude of 2,500 feet, I activated the release and pulled back forcefully. 9 Gs pressed me firmly into my seat, causing my vision to narrow. The Dauntless groaned as its wings flexed, then leveled out just above the water, speeding away. "Direct hit!" Snowden exclaimed. I adjusted the forward elevator. As I banked left, I observed that my bomb had struck its target flawlessly. Kerr's forward deck erupted into flames. Gallagher hit the aft section, with others also making successful strikes. Within moments, 4 direct hits had Kaga engulfed in flames from stem to stern. At the same time, Dick Best pulled out prematurely. Realizing his mistake, he and 2 wingmen redirected towards Akagi. Best successfully dropped his 1,000-pound bomb onto Akagi's deck-amid ships. It penetrated to the hangar and detonated among armed aircraft, transforming Akagi into an inferno. At precisely 10:22, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived and launched an assault on Sōryū. 3 1,000-pound bombs were dropped within a span of 30 seconds. The carrier erupted in an explosion, with a fire pillar soaring to 1,000 feet. 3 carriers were critically damaged in mere minutes. As I pulled away, the scene below resembled hell. Kara appeared as a floating volcano with explosions rippling through her structure. Her forward elevator, composed of tons of steel, was completely blown off, spinning through the air before crashing into the ocean hundreds of yards away. Akagi burned from bow to stern, its deck buckling under the intense heat. Tiny figures, the crew, leaped into the burning, oil-covered water. Sōryū was heavily listing, her hull torn apart by explosions. She rolled over, her hull glistening, before disappearing beneath the waves. In just 20 minutes, she transitioned from operational to a submarine tomb, taking over 700 men down with her. However, we missed the Hiryū operating 10 miles north, concealed by a rain squall. She was launching counterstrikes against our carriers. Zeros were at 3-0 high. Snowden's guns rattled as 2 fighters dove towards us. I advanced forward, utilizing our superior diving speed. Tracers zipped past us. Snowden's guns fell silent. "Snowden, are you all right?" "Hit, but okay." "I got one." A Zero trailed smoke, spiraling down towards the ocean. But more were on the way. I maintained a low altitude, constantly jinking. The fuel gauge was bouncing towards empty. The return flight was a nightmare, with the fuel gauge indicating empty, though there were usually a few gallons left. Unusable fuel was available if one flew with caution. I adjusted the mixture until the engine began to run roughly, risking fouled plugs for several more minutes. Around me, the dauntless aircraft was struggling. Some were trailing smoke, while others were running low on fuel. The radio channels were filled with urgent calls for help. The engine began to cut out as I approached. I marked the position for ditching. Enterprise. Multiple aircraft were in need of emergency fuel. Two Dauntlesses were ahead of me, their noses pointed toward the water. One pilot successfully executed a controlled ditching, and he, along with his gunner, climbed onto the wing before it sank. My engine sputtered. The reserve tank had only a few gallons left, enough for just a few minutes at most. Then the Enterprise appeared on the horizon. The deck was turned for recovery. Emergency fuel was requested. I was informed that I was number three. Number three. I watched as the two aircraft ahead of me landed. Each second was precious. The engine was missing badly. As I entered the landing pattern, the engine quit. I was on a dead stick approach. I had one chance. My altitude and speed were just sufficient. I lowered the landing gear and extended the flaps, aiming for the number 3 wire. The landing signal officer was signaling to cut. I was too high. I pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The propeller was windmilling. The deck rushed up to meet me. The wheels made contact, bounced, and the tailhook caught the wire, bringing me to a sudden stop. The deck crew rushed forward before the propeller came to a halt. "Get us out! We were wounded." They pulled Snowden from the rear. He had been hit in the shoulder and leg, but was conscious and would survive. My plane had sustained over 40 hits. How it held together, I will never understand. The ready room was somber despite our victory. Of the 14 torpedo bombers from our Torpedo Squadron, only 4 returned. 10 crews were lost. The news from the Hornets was even worse. Torpedo 8 was completely wiped out, with 15 aircraft down and 29 of 30 men killed. Only George Gay survived, floating as he watched us dive. John Waldron had led them straight in with his last transmission. "We will go in. We won't turn back. Good luck." No torpedoes hit their targets, but their sacrifice forced Japanese fighters to fly low, leaving the carriers exposed. McCluskey entered, his shoulder bandaged from a 20mm shell. We got 3. Kaga, Akagi, and Sōryū were finished. Hiryū was still operational and had hit the Yorktown. Intelligence provided further details. Yorktown was struck by 3 bombs at noon and 2 torpedoes at 14:30, and was now listing badly and abandoned. However, her sacrifice provided the necessary time to find Hiryū. The Japanese casualties have reached approximately 2,500 thus far. The officer indicated that each carrier had a crew of between 1,500 and 1,500, along with a few airmen who were rescued. Each figure represents a human life, someone's son, husband, or father, who perished in flames and water thousands of miles from home for the ambitions of the Empire. That afternoon, we launched another attack. At 1700, 24 dive bombers located Hiryū and dropped 4 bombs on her. She burned throughout the night before being scuttled. The Kido Bai ceased to exist. In the days that followed, while pursuing the retreating Japanese forces, we sank the cruiser Makuma. The strategic consequences became evident. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, which had taken years to construct and could not be quickly replaced. More significantly, over 3,000 trained sailors and airmen were lost, including more than 100 veteran pilots with years of experience who understood carrier operations in ways that could not be replicated, making them irreplaceable. The Japanese Navy never recovered. They began the war with 6 large carriers, but were left with only 2 Although they would attempt to build new ones, they would never again have the trained pilots necessary to make them effective. The institutional knowledge of the best carrier divisions was lost on June 4th. For the Americans, Midway demonstrated that intelligence could counteract numerical disadvantages. Rashfor's codebreakers provided us with the enemy's plans, allowing us to position ourselves for maximum advantage. Without that intelligence, we would have been forced to react, arriving late and fighting on their terms. The battle exposed critical weaknesses in the Japanese strategy. Yamamoto's plan was overly complex. His forces were scattered across thousands of miles, unable to support one another. The radio silence hindered coordination when the plan faltered. They underestimated American capabilities, assuming we would respond in a predictable manner. Nagumo faced impossible choices. When scouts reported American ships at 0728, he was in the process of rearming for a second strike at Midway. Should he launch immediately or wait to properly arm? His hesitation, a crucial 30 minutes, proved to be fatal. By the time he launched, we were already diving. That night, as the Enterprise steamed southwest, I stood on deck beneath the stars, the same stars that had shone over Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, witnessing the deaths of 4 carriers that day. With the adrenaline dissipated, only fatigue and a sense of void lingered. I reflected on the torpedo crews heading towards inevitable demise. Waldron's men were aware that their TBD devastators had become outdated death traps in the face of Zeros, yet they proceeded, maintaining their course while being mercilessly shot at, fulfilling their duty. George Gay observed as his comrades fell one by one. Waldron's aircraft erupted in flames and devastators spun into the ocean ablaze. Following that, there were 30 hours adrift in shark-infested waters, concealing himself beneath a seat cushion from Japanese vessels until rescued by a PBY. The burden of survivor's guilt would accompany him for the rest of his life. I contemplated the Japanese sailors I had assisted in killing, diving onto aircraft carriers. One could see men on deck scrambling, operating guns and pushing burning planes overboard. They were not faceless adversaries, but young men like us fighting for their homeland. Some pilots from Kaga and Akagi had been flying since the China conflict in 1937. They had families and aspirations that were extinguished in flames that June morning. The ocean was strewn with corpses. Destroyers managed to rescue a few, yet thousands perished, consumed by fire, attacked by sharks, or drowned. War is never clean, straightforward, or glorious. It is young men dying far from their homes. Historians designate Midway as the pivotal moment in the Pacific War. In a single day, the balance of naval power shifted dramatically. Japan transitioned from carrier dominance to parity. As American shipyards ramped up production, Japan faced a decline in superiority. True victory lay in the amalgamation of combat power, equipment, training, experience, and morale, which rendered forces effective. Japan lost a generation of seasoned pilots at Midway and through the attrition at Guadalcanal. These losses could not be compensated for. Japan's program was producing perhaps 100 carrier pilots annually, which could not compete with the American programs that were soon generating thousands. Admiral Nimitz later remarked that the battle was won due to intelligence officers deciphering for codes, damage control teams preparing the Yorktown in 72 hours when everyone else predicted it would take 3 months, and pilots launching attacks against overwhelming odds. Each component was vital to the American victory, which was also an industrial success. While the battle at Midway raged, new Essex-class carriers were being constructed, vessels that dwarfed anything Japan could manufacture. America would ultimately produce 24 Essex-class carriers. Japan faced challenges in completing 6 new aircraft carriers, primarily through conversions, none of which matched the capabilities of American vessels. Initially, Japan possessed 6 large carriers and the finest naval aviators in the world. Following the Battle of Midway, only 2 carriers remained operational, and many core pilots were lost. Although new carriers were added, there was insufficient training for pilots to operate them effectively. The meticulously assembled force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months effectively perished at Midway. I endured the war by flying 85 combat missions and was credited with striking 3 ships during the Midway operation, including the carriers Kaga and Hiryū. The cruiser Makuma was awarded the Navy Cross. I retired as a captain in 1962 after serving in Korea and lived to be 100, passing away in 2016 as one of the last surviving dive bomber pilots from Midway. McCluskey also recovered and retired as a rear admiral in 1956, never seeking recognition for his actions following that destroyer, a decision that altered the course of history. My son Phil remarked, "He was a quiet man, not one for grand speeches." He passed away in 1976, and his pivotal role has largely been forgotten. George Gay became a TWWA pilot after the war, dedicating decades to speaking about the sacrifices of his squadron. He authored Sole Survivor and participated in Navy events until his death in 1994, with his ashes scattered at the site where his squadron had fallen, reuniting him with the men he had witnessed perish 52 years earlier. Dick Best, who sank Akagi with a single precise bomb, was medically retired after Midway due to inhaling caustic soda from a faulty oxygen system which permanently damaged his lungs, preventing him from flying again, yet he lived until 2001. He is often referred to as the man who won Midway, while the Japanese carriers now rest on the Pacific floor at depths exceeding 17,000 feet. Recently, Kaga was discovered in 2019 sitting upright with its hull intact, although its deck was destroyed. Akagi nearby exhibited significant fire damage, serving as a war grave and a tomb for thousands. Admiral Nagumo survived, but never fully recovered, being relegated to shore commands and later tasked with the defense of Saipan, where he committed suicide in July 1944 as American forces overran the island. Chief of Staff Kusaka survived and wrote extensively, accepting responsibility while defending Nagumo's untenable decisions. Captain Fuida, the leader of the Pearl Harbor attack aboard Akagi, was wounded but survived, suffering broken ankles from an explosion, yet managing to escape. In the post-war period, he became a Christian missionary advocating for reconciliation between Japan and America. It is often stated that during the midway point of the conflict, Japan lost the war in a mere 5 minutes. Yamamoto was killed in April 1943 when P-38 aircraft, utilizing decoded messages, shot down his plane over Bougainville. After the Battle of Midway, it became evident to Japan that victory was unattainable, with reports indicating that he told his staff, "I have killed many young men today." The Midway Atoll was designated a national memorial in 2000, where Marines once faced insurmountable odds, now transformed into a wildlife sanctuary where albatrosses nest peacefully amidst the remnants of bombings. Norman Kleiss' account serves as a reminder that we were not heroes, but rather young men performing necessary tasks. The true heroes were the torpedo crews who, aware of their likely demise, proceeded regardless. The codebreakers who worked in secrecy, the mechanics who ensured the planes remained operational, and the damage control teams who saved ships, along with corpsmen who saved lives. against all odds. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that wars are not won solely by superior equipment or the most seasoned warriors. They are won by those who adapt, seize opportunities, endure losses, and persist. The Japanese possessed better pilots, aircraft, and experience, yet we had the advantage of broken codes, radar, and damage control, while they lacked the industrial capacity to replace their losses tenfold. Most crucially, the leaders understood the necessity of calculated risks. Nimitz risked the entire carrier force based on potentially flawed intelligence. McCluskey risked running low on fuel in pursuit of the Japanese. The best pilots risked everything by attacking a different carrier with only 2 wingmen. Waldron led his squadron to their deaths, fully aware that the mission required such sacrifice. The battle spanned 2 days, but altered the course of history. Prior to Midway, Japan was advancing relentlessly and appeared unstoppable. Afterward, they never won another offensive battle. The war continued for 3 more harrowing years, claiming hundreds of thousands of additional lives. However, the outcome was determined in those critical minutes of June 4th, when dive bombers struck Japan's carriers, while armed aircraft were still on deck. One must consider alternate histories. What if McCluskey had turned back at the empty intercept point? What if the Japanese had launched their attack 30 minutes earlier? What if the torpedoes had functioned properly and Torpedo 8 had sunk the carriers? These small decisions, chance occurrences, and individual choices ultimately shaped the fate of nations. Yet history is defined by what was evident in June 1942. In the morning, American pilots, outnumbered and flying inferior aircraft, managed to catch the world's most formidable carrier force at its most vulnerable moment and subsequently destroyed it. This pivotal moment turned the tide of war through a combination of intelligence, bravery, sacrifice, and a stroke of luck. The current generation cannot fathom a time when democracy itself was at risk. The survival of freedom was in question. We experienced this in June 1942. The fate of the free world depended on a few hundred pilots from 3 carriers in the mid-Pacific. We were sufficient. Despite the odds and the logic against us, we proved to be enough. This is the lesson of Midway. Ordinary individuals, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can rise to the occasion. Democracy cultivates warriors as courageous as any found in totalitarian regimes. Free men fighting for their homes and families represent the most formidable force on Earth. The statistics reveal that 357 Japanese lost their lives compared to 362 Americans. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk while 1 American carrier was lost. However, these statistics represent individuals, each with their own hopes, dreams, fears, and loved ones. Each death is a tragedy. Young men who should have lived to see their grandchildren perished in flames and water. The roles in the Pacific remain unchanged, unmarked by the battles fought. The coordinates where the carriers sank are now merely patches of ocean. Yet we remember, and must continue to remember for as long as free people exist. We must honor Midway and its heroes. They saved the world in mere minutes of devastation. 4 carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were reduced to smoldering wrecks in the time it takes to have breakfast. The course of the war, the fate of the nation, and the future of freedom were determined by dive bomber pilots who pressed their attacks against seemingly insurmountable odds. This is the legacy left behind. It is not solely about victory, but also about the example set. When tyranny looms, free people rise to the challenge. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. At times, the fate of the world rests on the shoulders of a few brave individuals, and ordinary people can achieve extraordinary feats. The fallen at Midway both American and Japanese, deserve to be remembered as human beings who sacrificed their lives in service to their countries. American pilots flew to their deaths in defense of freedom, while Japanese sailors perished in an effort to save their burning ships. All were brave men who deserved more than to die young in the heart of the Pacific. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Freedom not only survived but thrived. The Pacific, once a battlefield, is now a peaceful region traversed by merchants rather than warships. Japan and America, once bitter adversaries, are now close allies. The war seemed endless for over 75 years. Soon there will be no one left who can say, "I was there. I witnessed the Kaga explode. I observed Akagi burn. I dove through flak to strike my target." Yet the story must endure. It is essential to endure, because people who value freedom must understand that freedom is not free. It is purchased with the blood of men who climbed into outdated torpedo planes, flying towards death, diving through walls of flak, striking targets, giving everything to halt tyranny. That is what Midway accomplished. It halted tyranny, preserved freedom, and altered history. In world-changing moments, on a clear June morning in 1942, when the fate of the world hung in the balance, American pilots tipped the scales in favor of freedom.